Good afternoon and welcome to the panel on Chinese export credit trends. We are honored to be joined today by a distinguished panel of researchers who are joining Exim in reporting on current and past trends of Chinese export credit activities. Each year, Exim Bank reports in its annual competitiveness report on the scope and scale of major export credit providers' activities. Each year since 2000, Exim has worked to try to estimate the volumes of Chinese export credit support because their figures are not published as routinely and in a manner in which other export credit providers publish their figures. We have worked hard and in partnership with many other researchers to better understand these trends. So today, it is our honor to welcome to this panel researchers from William & Mary, Boston University, and Johns Hopkins University to discuss with us US government partners from the Office of Commercial Affairs of the Air Force, what they're seeing and the major trends that they are focused on in Chinese export credit activities. I will first turn it over to William & Mary, who was our leader in this research, and subsequently we will hear from those institutions in the order in which their research into the Chinese activities began. I can say for Exim Bank's research that we started monitoring trends since 2000 and reported as early as 2005 on trends in Chinese export credit activities in our competitiveness report. Our methodology has evolved since then, in large part due to the good work of these panelists, and we continue to strive to learn from these experts. So with that, I will turn it over now to Dr. Parks, who will lead us in this discussion. Dr. Parks, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Brad Parks, and I'm the Executive Director of AidData, which is a research lab at William & Mary, and it is a great privilege to be on a panel with such a full group of analysts who are all engaged in this common enterprise, and that is trying to better understand China's overseas development finance and trade finance portfolio. China is not especially transparent about its international lending or export credit activities. And for the better part of the last decade, my organization, AidData, has been engaged in an effort to answer a seemingly basic question, which is who is funding what, where, for whom, and to what effect? On my next slide, you'll see that we produce project level data on China's overseas development and trade finance portfolio for two primary audiences, for analysts and for decision makers. The last public release of our data set was in the fall of 2017. And today I'm going to give you a bird's eye view of the 2.0 version of this data set, which we will publicly release on the aiddata.org website alongside a white paper that analyzes the data set on Wednesday, September 29th. So let's start with an overview of the scope parameters of the data set. So first, the data set covers all official sector financial flows from China that align with the OECD's criteria for official development assistance and other official flows, commonly known as ODA and OOF. So that includes grants, technical assistance, loans, export credits, both for buyers and sellers, debt forgiveness, and debt rescheduling. The data set includes more than 10,000 projects. It captures more than $750 billion, and the geographical scope parameters are 165 countries covering every major world region. There's comprehensive coverage across sectors. It covers every low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income country in the world. And it provides comprehensive coverage across different sources of official financial flows from China. So there's something like 350 different Chinese government and state-owned financing institutions that are included in the data set. On the receiving side or the borrowing side, there's about 3,500 different recipient institutions. We also capture the implementing institutions, the contractors and subcontractors responsible for project execution. For both the recipient and the implementing institutions, we categorize the organizations both by type and by origin. So for type, this would be something like, is the recipient institution a government agency? Is it a state-owned enterprise? Is it a special purpose vehicle or a joint venture? A state-owned bank, a private sector institution, or an intergovernmental organization. With respect to the categorization of origin, we look at whether that institution is from China, from the host country, or from a third country. The data set has 68 variables. They include the official commitment amount, the currency of denomination for that commitment amount, or pricing details for all loans and export credits for which those details are available. So that includes the maturity, grace period, interest rate, the commitment and management fees. A new feature is we're now tracking at the transaction level the use of credit enhancements, 3 in particular: collateralization, guarantees, and credit insurance. Every flow, every loan or export credit, we calculate the grant element using the OECD's grant element calculator. So that provides, a measure of the level of financial concessionality. Every project is assigned a 3-digit OECD sector code, and every project is categorized as either ODA or OOF, again, using OECD criteria. Another feature of the new data set is far more extensive project descriptions. We call them cradle to grave project descriptions. They are, when you kind of stitch together the descriptions for the more than 10,000 projects, it's almost 2 million words. So, almost 19 full-length books. So the idea is to sort of document how these projects are being designed, how they're being implemented, and what's happening post completion, right? So kind of telling the story of each project. On the next slide, I'm just going to speak a little bit about the time frame of the data set. The data set covers 18 official commitment years. So every project is categorized according to the year in which an official commitment was issued to make that project possible. That period is 2000 to 2017. But we also track the implementation of those projects, both their implementation start years and end years. And that captures a 22-year period from 2000 all the way through to 2021. There are 3 year-level timing variables in the data set and 4 calendar day level timing variables. The year-level variables are the commitment year, the project implementation start year, and the project completion year. The calendar day level timing variables are the project implementation start date, the exact calendar day when the project started, and we capture that both in terms of what was planned and the actual start date. Then we do the same thing for the project completion date, what was planned and what was the actual completion date. Every project is also categorized according to its status. So we assign every project to one of the following categories. Is it backed by an informal pledge, an official commitment? Has it reached implementation? Has it reached completion? Or are we talking about a project that did reach the official commitment stage, but was subsequently suspended or canceled? And those status variables are based on information that's current through August 2021. With respect to the transaction types, I mentioned this before, but the kind of inclusion rule for what's in and what's out of the data set is that the transaction has to meet the OECD's criteria for official financing, so either ODA or OOF. In terms of how we document the transactions, we document them in their original currencies of denomination. And the reason why we do this is for comparability over geographic space and time. So we first take that commitment amount in its original currency of denomination, we convert it to nominal US dollars at the average exchange rate in effect during the commitment year, and then we convert it to constant US dollars using the OECD's deflation methodology. And that's to adjust for inflation and to ensure that comparability. Another new feature of the data set is that we're documenting the monetary value and the timing of the underlying commercial contracts that are being financed with the proceeds of these loans and export credits. We're also documenting the timing and the value of disbursements and repayments in the project descriptions. And finally, we are publishing the unredacted grant loan export credit and debt forgiveness or debt rescheduling agreements whenever we have obtained those. On the next slide, I'm going to just say a few words about the underlying methodology that supports the 2.0 data set. It is based on a catalog that we've developed of official sources of information for those 165 countries. So these include the verbatim agreements, the grant and loan, et cetera, the actual contracts between the counterparties. And many of these are being retrieved from government registers and gazettes. We also systematically extracted official records from the aid and debt information management systems of host countries. And then you can see here on the slides, some of the other official sources that are brought to bear. We supplement those official data with unofficial sources, so data from media outlets, civil society organizations, and research institutions. The data set is based on 90,000 sources. The average project record is based on 6.7 sources. In terms of languages, we primarily rely upon 7 sources in 7 different languages: Chinese, English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Arabic. However, for some countries where the language of business, the official language, is not one of those 7, for example, Farsi in Iran or Dutch in Suriname, we will use those host country languages. 88% of the records in the data set are underpinned by at least one official source. And then, we really believe in transparency of research methods and replicability. And to that end, we disclose all 90,000 sources at the individual project level. On the next slide, just tell you a little bit about what we see in the new data set, some of the kind of top line trends that I think bear mentioning. One is that we're just seeing a substantial increase in the face value of loans and export credits over time. We're seeing a sharp increase in the OOF to ODA ratio. So sometimes I talk about this as China's transition from benefactor to banker, right? They're really, proportionally speaking, providing smaller and smaller amounts of money via ODA and larger amounts of money via OOF. We also find in the data set that state-owned commercial banks are playing an increasingly important role in China's overseas lending and export credit activities. And proportionally, the policy banks, CDB and China Exim Bank, are playing smaller roles over time. We also find that one of the defining features of the BRI era is a rise in syndicated lending and co-financed, other types of co-financed transactions. And conversely, or I guess associated with that, is a declining proportion of transactions that are being financed bilaterally, so by a single creditor. Additionally, on the borrower side, what we're finding is a shift away from sovereign debt transactions, where the borrowers are government agencies, towards off-government balance sheet transactions, where the borrowers are special purpose vehicles or joint ventures, state-owned enterprises, or state-owned banks. We also see during the BRI era an expanded use of the credit enhancements that I previously mentioned: collateralization, guarantees, and insurance. And just to kind of give you an example, a sample project from the data set that in some ways is emblematic of some of these more recent trends during the BRI era. So in Jordan, a project supported by two Chinese state-owned commercial banks, China Construction Bank and ICBC, is the 485 megawatt Hussein combined cycle gas turbine project. This is a project that was co-financed with the EBRD, with the IFC, with Europe Arab Bank and the OPEC Fund for International Development through a syndicated loan. That loan benefited from a credit enhancement that was secured from MIGA. And the proceeds of, or the borrower of the loan was not a sovereign debtor, it was a special purpose vehicle. And then the proceeds of that loan were used to finance a commercial contract with a Chinese state-owned enterprise, SEPCO 3. So I'm going to stop there and maybe just mention one more time that the dataset will be publicly released on September 29th. I hope you will check it out on our website on aiddata.org, and that will be published alongside a white paper analyzing the dataset. So thanks again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you for setting the stage for us here. And we are happy here to look at the similarities and differences between these various research efforts. And you highlighted some major trends that I hope we can explore as well. But for right now, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Brodigan. But first, I'll say to the audience, please join us for a Q&A where we can get into a discussion on the major trends and gain more insights with the panelists. And that will be at 2:45 after this panel. So with that, I'll turn it over now to you, Dr. Brodigan.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to brief the US Ex-Im Bank community on our work. I'm Deborah Brodigan. I'm the Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where I direct the China-Africa Research Initiative. We established the China-Africa Research Initiative, or CARI, in 2014 to provide evidence-based analysis on Chinese engagement in Africa. And CARI builds on the research that I've been doing since 1983 on Chinese aid and investment in Africa. One of our research outputs is our China-Africa loan database, which I'll be talking about today. I began assembling this in 2006 when I was researching my 2009 book, The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China and Africa. In March this year, our loan database moved to Boston University, and we continue to collaborate with Boston University. On my next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the purpose of our data collection. It's to provide rigorously verified data to support evidence-based analysis of China-Africa lending and borrowing. We collect data on each loan from mainland Chinese financiers to African governments and African state-owned enterprises between 2000 and 2019. So we're right now cleaning the 2020 data. And I have to say that when AidData started their project almost 10 years ago, it was a great relief to me because I've been trying to track all of the grant financing as well. And that was just a very time-consuming detail with a lot of effort going into these tiny little grants. And so Brad's team has taken that over, and we really appreciate that so that we can focus just on the loans in Africa. So overall, we've tracked about US 153 billion in loan commitments for those 20 years. And in our data, we have 1,141 confirmed loan commitments from mainland Chinese financiers. We don't track commitments from Hong Kong or from Taiwan. And these include all of the different financiers. We don't differentiate between official finance or official development assistance because we believe it's very difficult to actually tell the difference there between what is OOF according to the OECD criteria and what is ODA according to the criteria. And so we include it all as lending. So, and for each of these, very similar to AidData, we track a number of different variables, including the project purposes, the financiers, the borrowers, the terms, et cetera. We do release our data after a lag of 1 year to allow for verification. And again, just to emphasize, our data that's released to the public is on loan commitments. And the next slide. We call our methodology forensic internet sleuthing, and that's informally, but it really is like detective work. And I think all of us that have worked in this area can kind of appreciate what it's like when you have a lead on a project and then you're trying to verify, does it actually exist or not? And so we spend many, many hours on individual projects trying to ascertain, was this really a loan commitment or was it not? And we draw primarily on official sources, which is why it takes a lag. Why we can't release the data right away, because we're trying to confirm it through official sources, usually African sources and Chinese sources for each loan. So we start by identifying these leads. We have multilingual teams. It's very similar again to what you heard with AidData. And then our classification system is a little different though. We have three major ones: unconfirmed, confirmed, and bogus. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are. Unconfirmed are ones where we couldn't find confirmation that a loan had actually been signed officially. And so we hold those off until we can confirm them. Bogus are reports that turned out not to be a loan, or were a loan, but they weren't made by a Chinese entity, or it was actually an investment, or it was a rumor or a mistake. And so we find quite a few of these that we're able to put aside as not being a Chinese signed loan. And each year we revisit the status of these confirmed loans and loan commitments and the unconfirmed. And most of the data that we have, we're a little different than AidData in this regard. We keep it on the back end and we only release what we've been able to confirm on the front end, because we're concerned about false positives, in particular false negatives, getting out there, although it is available on request to other researchers. So in the next slide, I'll show a little bit about how this works. So for the 2019 data, for example, we were collecting examples and leads from 2019 into 2020. And in 2020, we start cleaning this. So there were 97 reports of new Chinese loans that were gathered through our methodology during this period. So we have an average of 6 sources per confirmed loan. And out of this 97, we confirmed 37 as having been signed during 2019. And those we released to the public. But 60 loans or loan reports we keep on the back end. And out of those, we found that 38 we could not confirm. And it may be that some of those would be confirmed or signed in the following year. So we keep tracking those. And then the bogus ones, we found actually 22 reports of loans that had come out in various sources, turned out never to have been signed and never to have become official. So AidData is a little different. They have something called the pipeline pledge. And a lot of the loans in that area are the ones that we keep on our back end and they publish. So we have a different approach there. So in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about our public interactive database. So we have all of our data out in the public, and we built an interactive database, which is kind of fun and easy to use. So I'll use the case of Zambia to illustrate how this works, but this is all available at China Africa Loans Data.org. And we'll have the actual URL at the end. So as of 2019, we had 153 billion and 1,141 confirmed loans. And you can see the way this works is that you would hover over one of the countries, and we're going to use Zambia as an example. And in the next slide, we'll see how that works. So if this was live, we would be hovering over Zambia now. And so in Zambia, we've got 9.9 billion in loan commitments with 72 loans. And you can see down at the bottom, the timeline from 2000 through 2019, how that lending has grown. And over in the right-hand side, there's a synopsis of the sector. So primarily in transport, second in power, and third in defense. And if you were to go down to that right-hand corner and click download data, another screen would open up. And so in the next slide, we'll see what data becomes available there. So online, it's possible to download all of the variables that we release to the public. But here in the interactive database, since we clicked on Zambia, what becomes available to see here without downloading it is year by year, all of the different the amount, the country, of course, all Zambia in this instance, the lender, the sector, the purpose. And then for the download version, you can click up at the top, you can barely see it where it says other fields. And then the other variables that we have available would also become you'd be able to access those. And I use this particular screenshot because, as you can see under lender, we have a number of different Chinese lenders here. We have China Development Bank, Exim Bank, we have ICBC, we have different Chinese companies like Polytechnologies, the Bank of China. And Zambia is actually the country in Africa where we found the largest number of individual Chinese lenders, and also the largest number of different Chinese contractors that were getting access to this finance for their projects. So we also include as one of the variables whether or not there's a resource security or Sinosure guarantees or other kinds of collateralization for the loan. In the next slide, we'll see some of what we've been able to demonstrate in terms of trends. So over the past decade, this is a snapshot of what Chinese lending has looked like in Africa. So I also like to separate out Angola because I think Angola really, it's such a big part of the data that because China has committed about US 43 billion in commitments just to Angola between 2000 and 2019. And most of these loans are backed by revenues from Angolan oil exports that are deposited into an escrow account. This is not typical for the rest of the continent. In fact, if you take Angola out of the data, only about 8% of the loans in Africa have that kind of resource security. So Chinese loans to Angola in 2016, as you'll see, this is really out of the ordinary. They accounted for about 19 billion just in that year, and it really distorts. If you were to look at that all together with and without the Angola data, you can see how Angola distorts this kind of overall understanding of what China's doing. So if we exclude Angola, we can see that Chinese financing in Africa peaked in 2013. And this is a really important finding. If we see in the next slide, we can see how Chinese lenders have been responding to the weaker borrowing environment by sending out less. So at the bottom, we have China Exim Bank, which is your main competitor. But as you can see, there are many other entities now that are financing projects in Africa that Exim Bank would be competing with as well, directly or indirectly. But China Exim Bank peaked in 2013 and has been declining ever since then. And so the other Chinese financiers, which are all in the gray part here, include, well, we won't go into the details on that. But in the next slide, we'll see how this all looks in Zambia, which is actually an outlier in terms of these. So the next slide. So here we have the relationship portrayed, I think, fairly graphically between the Chinese loans and the Chinese firms' contracted project revenues. So political scientists talk about China as a system of fragmented authoritarianism, and we can really see this playing out in Chinese lending in Africa. The case of Zambia with a large number of Chinese lenders, I think we have about 15 in that instance, or even more. This also shows how Chinese lenders and Chinese projects work together and how they don't. So the green line is the contracted project's annual revenue. And so this is what Chinese companies that are doing construction projects, engineering projects in Zambia, this is what they report back as their revenues. Whereas the bars are the Chinese finance going into Zambia. And so there's not a one-to-one relationship here. The companies are usually making a lot more in revenues than the loans that are going in. And there's a little bit of an exception there in 2016 when a lot of loan finance went in, but then with a lag, the revenues for the Chinese companies went up. So in my next slide, I'll show you one more example of what we like to do with our data, which is to show it in comparative perspective. So what we've got here is our data. We've got China Exim Bank again in blue and the other Chinese financiers in gray. And next to them is the World Bank, which is all of the different windows, the lending windows of the World Bank. And these are all loan commitments. And so between 2010 and 2019, what we can see is that some of what I think the overstated alarm about the size of Chinese lending is tempered by analyses like these. So in 5 of the past 10 years, the World Bank alone has been a larger lender in Africa than all Chinese creditors combined. And so I think that helps to provide some perspective. And on the next slide, I will leave. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brodigan. And thank you for drawing some differences and distinctions between your research and methodology, and that used by William and Mary, described by Dr. Parks. These are exactly the same questions that we at EXIM struggle with in terms of which loans and what activities to include in our own count of Chinese activities. And in that process, I will just mention your reference to China EXIM as EXIM's main competitor. We also do look at Sinosure activity because unlike EXIM Bank that houses both direct lending and insurance guarantee capabilities, in China, there are two institutions, Sinosure and China EXIM Bank, that the Chinese report as being their dual official export credit system. So we also are focused on activities covered by our counterpart, Sinosure. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ray from Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Dr. Ray, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to follow such illustrious panelists. I'm a senior academic researcher at the Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center, as we like to call it. And whereas my peers who have already spoken today have come at this issue trying to understand what China is supporting abroad, broadly speaking, and that's such an important question to ask, we at the GDP Center have a history of looking at the important work that institutions like US EXIM and other export credit agencies and development banks around the world do, and not only their economic impact, but also their social and environmental impact and the prospects for sustainable development that are furthered by this important work. And so we come to this question primarily asking about China's policy banks, China EXIM and the China Development Bank, because a few years ago, they started rivaling the World Bank in the scale of their loan commitments. And we realized we need to know not only what they're doing and where, but we need to know the precise geographic footprints of these loans so we can conduct environmental and social risk and impact analyses to help stakeholders at the corporate, government, and community level understand how to react to and how to interact with this new stream of development finance. So on the next slide, I have a bit of an overview of what we found, how we do it, and how it fits into a larger model of China's approach to development finance, which is a bit different from what we've seen in the West. So overall, since we're here to think about export credit activities in particular, if we just look at China EXIM, or CHEXIM as we sometimes call it, we've tracked and geolocated 218 billion to 90 countries during the global business cycle from 2008 to 2019. To give you some sense of context, US EXIM, just the direct loans that US EXIM has approved came to about 40 billion in that same time period. So China EXIM is putting out direct loans of about 5 to 6 times as much, but it's highly concentrated in just a few countries, as I'll show you in a moment. Because of our special focus on development finance and the environmental and social impacts of it, we've developed a methodology that really draws on what we can learn from these wonderful peers who've established and fleshed out this research field and then honed it specifically for environmental and social analysis. So I'll walk through what we've learned from our peers and how we try to push it a little forward on the environmental and social aspects. And then I'll talk a bit about drivers. There are push factors. We've heard some about China supporting its businesses overseas. There's a broad field of studies showing that as Chinese capacity exceeded Chinese demand internally, they started supporting their businesses overseas, right? But there's also many more push factors than that, as well as pull factors. These projects are requested and applied for by borrowing countries. It's important to remember. This is not a story of China unilaterally putting projects in countries around the world. And then finally, I'll wrap it up by showing how this all fits into a coordinated model, as my co-panelists have mentioned, of cooperation between various Chinese entities, as well as host countries. On the next slide, I mapped that 218 billion from just Chexim direct loan commitments around the world from 2008 through 2019. And as you can see here, it touches just their export credit activities, just Chexim touches every continent in the world, every region of the developing world. Although it is fairly concentrated, these countries that I've highlighted here each have borrowed at least 5 billion just from Chexim over this time period, and they account for over half of the total. If you move on to the next slide, I'll talk about how we reached this conclusion. As we've heard, this field is burgeoning, and our peers at William & Mary and Johns Hopkins have really shown the world what can be done with just a lot of elbow grease, smarts, and internet sleuthing. Because of our special focus on development finance and environmental and social analysis, we've added a few innovations to it to try to help this angle of analysis in particular. And there's 3 of these innovations across this rather complicated looking flowchart. If you look at the top right, in addition to all of the wonderful work that we can draw on from our peers, we've also developed an in-house web scraper that is language neutral and region neutral, meaning that every major host country language, in addition to English and Chinese, and in addition to major languages around the world, also Indonesian and Vietnamese, and every major host country language is included in it. And we were inspired by AidData's extreme breadth in being able to draw on a host of sources. And then we were inspired by Johns Hopkins to introduce this double verification method to really only produce and publish projects that we know for sure that Chexim and their peer CDB have actually signed. Because as we all know, sometimes politicians like to announce projects before they're actually signed. And then because of our focus on usability for stakeholders at the community, corporate, and government level, we lay eyes on the actual geographic footprint of every project in our data set. And that means combing through engineering drawings and feasibility studies and environmental impact assessments. It means scouring open infrastructure maps and Google Maps and many other satellite images to find the precise geographic location of each of them to help stakeholders make the best decisions possible with regard to this new source of development finance. On the next slide, I show how we put all of this out there for you and stakeholders around the world to access and use, hopefully. At this website, we have our interactive data set, which shows you dots around the world, but you'll notice that those dots are all different colors. And we've colored them in different ways to indicate 3 types of social and environmentally sensitive territory that stakeholders may want to be conscious of as they approach and interact with these projects. The colors indicate whether a project overlaps with indigenous territory or national protected areas or possible critical habitats for global biodiversity. And then if you click on one of those, you can find all of the information that we publish about it, including the footprint, the size of the footprint, what kind of sensitive territory it is in, who borrowed, who lended, for how much money. But you can also go through and download a shape file if you want to interact and do actual environmental analysis of the footprints of each of those projects. On the next slide, we have a few things jump out at us from all of this data. If we combine CDB and Chexim, as Deborah said, it's comparable to the World Bank on the global scale. They've each lent out a little under $500, a little under $500 billion during this time period. But as you can see, the sectoral balance is vastly different. Whereas the World Bank overwhelmingly lends in government, social services areas, CDB and Chexim are lending in projects where they can support their companies overseas. Export credit is a primary theme here, even if it's coming through CDB rather than their export credit agency. On the next slide, we talk some about, we have drivers. I've put here some push factors, some pull factors. One of the reasons why I'm asked frequently, why is China lending abroad? And there are many answers to this. One of them is overcapacity domestically. We all know how astronomically China's domestic GDP grew during the previous business cycle, with cities popping up every week, it seemed. When the demand for that cooled in order to prevent an economic catastrophe domestically, China continued to support those firms by lending abroad, right? Just as US Exim supports US small businesses overseas. China Exim and CDB support the activities of small and large Chinese firms abroad. There's also the fact that China during the previous business cycle had a tremendous glut of dollar reserves. At one point, they were sitting on close to $3.5 trillion in dollar reserves. They could sit on those in US Treasury bonds, earning historically low interest rates, or they could leverage them by lending them abroad. And as you can see in this chart, there's a similarity in the trend from about 2018 through about 2016 through 2017 with a 1-year lag between China's current account surplus, essentially their trade surplus plus a little more, and the amount of money they were lending out through these policy banks. And they declined at the same rate. The difference is this most recent year, we're starting to collect data on 2020 as well. And we've seen a real deviation here that, of course, this was not a good year to start new projects, but China is drawing in those dollars again. Their trade surplus is rising. And so we're very interested to see whether or not they leverage that money moving forward. And of course, there are the pull factors. The foundations platform of the G20 estimates that to reach the Paris Agreement commitments and the Sustainable Development Goals will require investments of $7.6 trillion every year for the next decade. That's astonishing, and it's vastly more than every development finance institution in the world is putting out. So the demand for this finance is still vastly outpacing the supply. So push factors and pull factors are both very important. In the next slide, we talk about how these come together. There we go. These come together in a model of what at the GDP Center we call coordinated credit space. It's not simply a relationship between a bank and a borrowing country, right? We can see here that on the Chinese side, Chinese ministries, Chinese policy banks are not just relating to borrowing governments, but also to Chinese firms. Chinese commercial banks are lending to Chinese firms as well as foreign firms. All of this comes together in development projects. Because there are so many different interests involved here, it opens up the credit capacity of these banks because projects don't have to just have a financial return on investment on a given project, the way we usually see in the West. Instead, they can have a broader economic return on investment, either through employment or utilizing capacity abroad or firm profits. Whether we would or not include those in the return on investment calculation here in our traditional Western development finance approach, which helps expand their reach. And I'll give you a little example of that on the next slide. This is from a recent GDP Center paper comparing the firms that are supported in bilaterally financed power plants around the world. Chinese finance projects, Japanese finance projects, and US finance power plants around the world. On the left here, we see equipment manufacturers, the nationality of the firms involved. And on the right, those that were providing the service of engineering and construction. The orange and red parts of each of those pie charts are a country's own firms abroad. And you can see here in the bottom left, US finance plants tremendously support US equipment manufacturers overseas. We're exporting goods with this export credit. However, on the right, you can see we're not supporting US firms when it comes to the services of engineering and building those plants. In the top right, you can see that China stands as a stark contrast to that, financing their firms across the supply chain, not just supplying the equipment, but also building the facilities. On the next slide, I will leave you with an example of what this looks like in practice. This is a photograph of the largest solar plant in Argentina, the Cauchari solar plant. It is the largest in the country, and it is in the world's second most powerful solar capacity zone. The best solar capacity in the world is in the Himalayas, and the second best solar capacity in the world is in the very northwest corner of Chile and Argentina in the desert. But there's been a dearth of development finance going into these new sectors in developing countries. China was willing to take that risk, not only because of the financial return on investment, but because of the economic return on investment by supporting bilateral ties, supporting their own firms abroad, getting a foothold in the supply chains of the borrowing countries. And so you can see here how all of those parts of that coordinated credit space came together for this project. Chexim lent 331 million. The provincial government of Jujuy, Argentina also floated a green bond for their part. It's owned by the provincial energy company of Jujuy. But 3 different Chinese firms, large and small, were involved here, not only in providing equipment, the solar panels and the inverters, but also the construction itself. So they've supported an entire supply chain with multifaceted economic benefits, not only for Argentina's sustainable development and their Paris commitments, but also supporting Chinese firms abroad and also strengthening that entire network of collaboration around credit space. So with that, I'll leave you with this example and turn it back to our hosts.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, for walking us through your research and once again drawing attention to some of the differences with your research, delving into environmental and social aspects, and building off of the good work that we heard earlier from Dr. Brodigan and Dr. Parks on. I am now going to turn it over to Mr. Hubert, who is joining us from the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis of the Air Force. We had the opportunity to partner with Dr. Hubert, and we were very glad to do so because, as you can hear from these speakers, there are so many resources being devoted to this research that far outpace the research resources that Exim Bank has to devote to for its competitiveness report. So we were able to partner with OSEA and try to use some of their research in our own analysis in this year's competitiveness report. So I'm happy to turn it over to Mr. Hubert, who will go over some of the findings of that research with you today. Mr. Hubert.
Great, thanks, Isabel. So now I fully appreciate how Howard Wolowitz feels like on Big Bang Theory, being the only Mr. in an esteemed group here. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this conference. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk about, everybody might be saying, why is the Department of Defense here? In particular, why is the Air Force here? Well, we have relationships across, right? So we aren't really the data folks in this, but we do look at a lot of the work by these folks that previously spoke, right? That the work that they're doing, and we hire some of the people that graduate from their programs as well to continue folks looking at this problem set. So the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, right? While we sit within the Air Force, we're made up of 2 groups. One is a group called Strategic Initiatives, really looking at industrial policies, foreign industrial policies, and then how do you work, with some of our allies and partners, as well as countering folks in strategic competition. So that is one of our big mainstays. We also have another group that does portfolio management, really looking at industry sectors and the markets that are using those, because we're not just about the defense industrial base. We look at the global industrial base and how does defense play in that. To the point that how can we leverage or partner with other markets out there for those industry sectors that are critical to us. One of the things that we do come with, though, and I mentioned that we do a lot of Belt and Road Initiative work, analysis of it, but how do you engage? Looking at it from a counter perspective, and we do that. If you look across defense, there's geographic commanders that are engaged with leadership with countries within their geographic areas. We provide them information that helps them with those engagements, as well as from the DoD, while the Air Force, we have access up to the Secretary of Defense to affect policy, right? And we weigh in on Committee for Investment in the US, right? Stuff like that. The potential for new policies for basically a backwards looking CFIUS process, right? So investment outside of the US, what would that mean? as well as we work with the interagencies. So we have relationships with Department of State, Commerce, Treasury, and EXIM, right? So we have built a relationship with them. So we don't necessarily collect a lot of this data. We use it a lot and do analysis. While I'm not a doctor, I actually have a third of the staff at OSEA are doctorates. 8 of them, in fact, are doctors of economy. So we have some fairly extensive econometric modeling that we can use to help us understand its impact modeling. But if you do this, what can happen, or to get an understanding of how we can engage to start to make a difference. So it's pretty exciting. Next slide. So one of the things, so we did partner with EXIM to use, like I said, a lot of the data that's being provided by the folks participating on this panel with some additional data. We collect a lot of business intelligence data is really where we are, and how you group that data into understanding it, again, the industry sectors and the markets to see, kind of tease out where is this going. So, and we work a lot with the industry side of this. We do work with academia, and I'll talk about that at the very end. But we did a lot of analysis across a lot of what China export was doing. And we really came up with three key findings, right? One was that a broad field of lenders and a large amount of capital is dedicated to supporting Chinese exporters, right? To that point, right, in the past 10 years, financing in the amount of over 1.3 trillion. Now, we have seen a decrease, like what Dr. Parks spoke about, in the last 3 years. So we have seen a decline, but it means that other lenders now represent the bulk of Chinese export assistance. So with that, another finding was that Chinese export assistance aligns with key PRC technology and infrastructure initiatives. And I'm going to talk more in depth into what we did with some modeling to help actually drive this home. But one of the keys out of this, 49 to 54, so 91% of the identified entities are either fully or partially state-owned, meaning that the states have an ability to direct where the Chinese lending is going. And if you see where she's going now, that perfectly fits in line, right? Everything, they're proving that state-directed works, right? And the last is that Chinese export and trade-related financiers support Chinese exporters working in EXIM US Bank's key transformational export areas, which is one of the things that we were trying to look at, was help them understand where this was actually happening. Next slide, please. So what we have here, these are just, like I said, some of the pieces that came out, just to put it in perspective, right? But you start to see the decline, right? And where this came out, and the difference between what was going in between cross-border and domestic. So Chinese exporters receive support from Chinese export and trade-related lenders for both domestic and cross-border activities related to high priority sectors and industries. That bottom left is just to give you a sense. So yes, 91% are either state-owned or mixed ownership, which is key, which is one of the reasons why we focus in on that business intelligence data for understanding how ownership is structured within those, so that we can actually trace up and down from state-owned entities. And also it gives us, one of the things that we tend to look at is PLA affiliations, right? So it helps us understand and trace that back to them. But also, in the bottom right, that Chinese exporters receive support from China's export and trade related financing entities for both domestic and cross-border activities related to high priority sectors in industry. Just another way to show that in those industries, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those as we go. Next slide, please. All right, so what we did is after we pulled all of that data and provided some analysis for EXIM, back on our side, we took that information and started plugging it into some of the modeling. So not just the econometric modeling, but we started actually putting them into transportation and logistics modeling. And what we started to find is that we looked at 124 projects in 10 Belt and Road corridors, where that we actually could identify funding amounts, right, for 75 projects that ran about $369 billion. And you see, based off of the project types, where those really broke out and where the emphasis was. Some of the key findings, or some of the key things that really came out of that, is that with these projects, 64 or 65% of the cost reductions are associated with lower transportation times, right? So by implementing these, really what you see is China, it's not, if you look at them singularly, it wouldn't come out, but holistically, it's actually a national trade route strategy. I've never been able to find it in writing, right, even in Mandarin or anything, but you start to see that through these trade routes, right, that actually speed to market is revenue. Just folks don't always look at it that way. But one of the keys out of this is that Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands achieved 54% of the reduction in bilateral trade costs. So it's access to Europe is the other piece, and a huge beneficiary of this, which is where we traditionally play. The other thing is that all of this was done through loans and grants, right? That have to be paid back. That's what we've been talking about. If you look based off of had China just fully funded them, just outright funded them without loans and grants, and then based off of the revenue from speed to market, as well as having the governments pay for them for use, they would achieve revenue realization within 6 years. So just by the revenue generated from these projects in trade, they could fund them outright and pay them off in 6 years. That is mind-boggling to us, right? And they're not. They're getting them paid back. So it's a huge benefit for them. Next slide, please. So really, that's where I am with this. One of the things that I wanted to put a quick plug in for, so through the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis, we actually have a UARC, right? So a university affiliated research center with the University of Maryland. And we've been looking at how would we build an academic data consortium looking at Belt and Road Initiative. If folks are interested, please let us know. We're looking, we have a relationship with William and Mary already, Texas A&M University, but happy to talk to folks. We've been engaged with the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security to get funding, and they're extremely interested in this. So I think there's a great opportunity to continue this as we move further and help folks get more access to the data, to put more analysis to the data, which is the key. So thank you. Isabel, back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you all for joining today's panel. I hope that you are able to join us at 2:45 for the question and answer post-panel discussion on Chinese export credit activities. Our intention was to present Exim Bank's research effort, and Ms. Osuobeni will present that to you at the top of the Q&A at 2:45, and we will welcome back the academics here to engage with you on your questions and answers. So thank you so much to all of our panelists, and we hope to see you in the Q&A room.